Officers standing on the deck of the destroyer Yukikaze peered through their binoculars on the morning of March 3, 1943, watching something that seemed to defy everything they understood about aerial combat. The time was exactly 10 o'clock, and they were positioned in the Huon Gulf off the coast of New Guinea. What caught their attention were 12 twin-engine bombers racing toward their convoy at an altitude so low that the wash from their propellers was actually creating visible trails across the surface of the water below them. Through their magnified lenses, these Japanese naval officers were counting something that seemed impossible according to every manual they had studied. American bombers were approaching at mast height, flying in a tactical formation that contradicted all conventional military thinking of the era. The next quarter hour would completely rewrite what Japanese naval commanders believed about the balance of power in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Within those 15 brutal minutes, 8 transport vessels carrying nearly 7,000 desperately needed reinforcements would be converted into burning debris floating on the ocean surface. 4 destroyer escorts that had successfully protected convoys across the Pacific since the opening days following Pearl Harbor would be shattered beyond repair. Every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy had developed about how aircraft and ships interacted in combat would sink into the depths of the Bismarck Sea, along with 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors whose lives would end that morning. What those Japanese officers watching through their binoculars didn't understand yet was that the aircraft bearing down on them weren't conventional bombers operating under standard doctrine. These were B-25 Mitchell bombers that had been fundamentally transformed by an unconventional engineer named Paul Gunn, who everyone called Pappy. These aircraft had been converted into something resembling flying battleships, each one mounting 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. The engagement about to unfold would prove that American innovation had produced something the Japanese military establishment simply couldn't conceive of existing. Here were bombers that wouldn't release their ordnance from high altitude in the traditional manner, but would instead skip their bombs across the water's surface like children skipping stones, all while unleashing continuous streams of armor-piercing ammunition at their targets. The convoy that had departed from Rabaul just past midnight on the 1st of March in 1943 represented what would be the final major attempt to reinforce the garrison at Leh using surface ships. General Hitoshi Imamura commanded the 8th Area Army, and his forces desperately required these reinforcements to maintain their hold on New Guinea, which represented the last significant barrier protecting the southern approaches to the Japanese Empire itself. The escort force was under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who had assembled 8 of the Imperial Navy's most combat-experienced destroyers for this critical mission. The destroyers Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo formed a protective screen around the 8 transport vessels they were assigned to protect. These transports, designated as the Ayo Maru, Kenbu Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Teiyo Maru, and the naval auxiliary vessel Nojima were loaded with the entire 51st Division, consisting of 6,900 elite soldiers, along with sufficient supplies and ammunition to sustain the Leh garrison for several months of operations. Every detail of the convoy's departure had been carefully calculated and planned. Japanese meteorological services had forecasted 3 consecutive days of storms, which would provide ideal cover from American aerial reconnaissance activities. 100 Zero fighters stationed at various bases scattered across New Britain and New Guinea had been assigned to provide continuous air cover throughout the voyage. The route had been plotted to hug the northern coastline of New Britain, which would minimize the amount of time the convoy would be exposed in open waters where American aircraft could attack. Captain Tamichi Hara was in command of the destroyer Yukikaze, and he would later author a memoir titled Japanese Destroyer Captain. In recent weeks, he had observed disturbing changes in American tactical approaches. Bombers were attacking from progressively lower altitudes, and intelligence reports indicated the Americans were making significant modifications to their aircraft. According to accounts he provided after the war ended, His concerns about these developments were generally dismissed by superior officers who believed that American desperation was causing them to make tactical errors. What the Japanese command structure didn't know was that a genuine revolution in aerial warfare had been taking place in the maintenance workshops and airfields scattered around Port Moresby and Townsville. Beginning in August of 1942, Major Paul Gunn, who had previously served as a Navy pilot before transferring to the Army Air Forces, had been systematically transforming standard medium bombers into weapons that had never existed before. The innovation that Gunn developed emerged from absolute necessity rather than theoretical planning. Traditional high-altitude bombing techniques employed against naval targets were achieving hit rates of less than 1%. When bombardiers released their ordnance from 10,000 feet altitude, even the most skilled among them struggled to hit targets that were constantly moving. Ships could observe bombs falling through the air and had several minutes to execute evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft fire was particularly effective against aircraft operating at medium altitudes. Something fundamentally different was required. Working with salvaged components recovered from wrecked fighter aircraft, Gunn began installing .450 caliber machine guns in the nose sections of B-25 bombers, replacing the bombardier's traditional glazed compartment with solid metal construction. He added 4 additional guns mounted in packages below the cockpit area, creating a total of 8 forward-firing weapons. Each individual gun was capable of firing 850 rounds per minute of armor-piercing ammunition, with each bullet traveling at 250 miles per hour, 1,910 feet per second. When combined together, a single modified B-25 could deliver 6,800 bullets per minute in a concentrated stream of fire. Major Ed Larner commanded the 91st Bomb Squadron, which was part of the 3rd Bomb Group, and his unit had spent weeks perfecting the skip bombing technique that would be employed. Flying at 200 feet altitude or lower, they would release 500-pound bombs that had been fitted with specially configured delay fuses, allowing the bombs to skip across the water's surface before impacting ship hulls. The fuses were calibrated to detonate 4 to 5 seconds after release, which was precisely enough time for the bomber to clear the blast radius of the explosion. The technique had been practiced repeatedly using the wreck of the SS Pruth in Port Moresby Harbour as a target, and crews had trained until they could consistently hit their targets. Through extensive trial and error, optimal parameters had been established. Aircraft needed to maintain an altitude between 200 and 250 feet, maintain an airspeed between 200 and 250 miles per hour, and release bombs at a distance of 60 to 100 feet from the target vessel. The protective storm cover that the convoy was relying upon began breaking up earlier than meteorological predictions had indicated. At 10 o'clock in the morning on March 2nd, a B-24 Liberator conducting reconnaissance operations spotted the convoy through a gap that had opened in the cloud cover. Within hours of this sighting, 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group were airborne and departing from Port Moresby. The B-17S executed their attack from 7,000 feet altitude, which was lower than their typical bombing altitude but still positioned them above the effective range of anti-aircraft weaponry. They bracketed the convoy formation with 1,000-pound demolition bombs. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the transport vessel Kyokusei Maru sustained direct hits on her forward cargo holds. Fires spread rapidly to the ammunition storage areas, forcing the crew to abandon the burning ship. 900 soldiers were evacuated from the doomed transport and distributed among the destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo. These 2 destroyers, now carrying dangerous overloads of personnel, raced ahead of the convoy at maximum speed to reach Leh, where they deposited their human cargo before rejoining the convoy formation early on March 3rd. This emergency run saved the lives of those 900 men, but it reduced the convoy's escort strength during a critical period of vulnerability. What the Japanese command didn't realize was that the B-17 attack had served as reconnaissance by fire, a deliberate tactic designed to test defensive capabilities and force the convoy to break its formation in preparation for what would follow. Allied operational planners had deliberately employed high-altitude bombing initially to gauge the convoy's anti-aircraft capabilities and compel the ships to break their protective formation. The morning of March 3rd dawned with clear skies over the Huon Gulf, which was catastrophically clear conditions from the Japanese perspective. During the night hours, the convoy had rounded the Huon Peninsula and was now exposed in open water, positioned only 80 miles from their destination at Leh. Safety seemed tantalizingly within reach. At 7:55 in the morning, lookouts stationed aboard the Japanese ships spotted the first wave of attacking aircraft approaching from the southern horizon. But these aircraft weren't flying at 7,000 feet altitude like the B-17s from the previous day's attack. These were skimming just above the wavetops, flying so low that spray created by their propellers was clearly visible from the ships. As the aircraft closed to a distance of 2,000 yards, their noses suddenly erupted in streams of tracer fire. 8 separate lines of bullets from each modified B-25 converged on the ships, specifically targeting anti-aircraft gun positions. Japanese gunners attempting to man their defensive weapons were cut down by the concentrated fire before they could effectively respond. Those who took cover to protect themselves from the strafing couldn't simultaneously defend their ships from attack. Following closely behind the strafing B-25s came Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, adding their own devastating firepower consisting of 4 20mm cannons and 6.303 machine guns per aircraft. The combined assault from American and Australian aircraft proved overwhelming, effectively suppressing anti-aircraft defences across the entire convoy formation. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, Major Ed Larner led 12 B-25s from the 91st Bomb Squadron into their attack run. Flying in formations of 3 aircraft at 200 feet altitude, they bore down on the convoy at 250 miles per hour. This was the moment that months of intensive training had prepared them for. The lead bomber released its bomb approximately 300 yards from the transport vessel Shinai Maru. The bomb struck the water surface, skipped twice across the waves, and slammed into the ship's hull just above the waterline. 4 to 5 seconds after release, exactly as the delay fuse had been calibrated, the bomb detonated inside the cargo hold, literally ripping the ship apart from within. The transport Kenbu Maru, which was loaded with drums containing aviation fuel, took a skip bomb amidships. The resulting explosion ignited the volatile cargo, creating a fireball that rose 500 feet into the air. The ship disintegrated within seconds, leaving only burning debris scattered across the water surface. The Io Maru absorbed multiple direct hits in rapid succession. Her hull was opened like someone had used a can opener on sheet metal. The Oigawa Maru, whose captain was desperately trying to maneuver away from the attacking aircraft, took bombs from 2 different B-25s, and her back was broken by the explosions. She jackknifed and went down within minutes of being hit. The destroyer Asashio, commanded by Captain Yasuo Sato, raced to position herself between the attackers and the vulnerable transports. She was immediately bracketed by 3 B-25s simultaneously. Skip bombs slammed into her engine rooms, while thousands of machine gun bullets swept her decks completely clear of human life. Dead in the water and burning fiercely, she became a stationary target for following waves of attack aircraft. By 10:15 in the morning, exactly 15 minutes after Major Larner had released his first bomb, 7 of the 8 transports were either sinking or already sunk beneath the waves. 3 destroyers, the Asashio, Arashio and Tokitsukaze, had been mortally wounded and were going down. The Shirayuki would sink during the hours that followed. The convoy had effectively ceased to exist as an organized military force. The destruction of the ships themselves was only the beginning of the human tragedy that would unfold. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many of whom were unable to swim, were thrown into the oil-covered waters of the Huon Gulf. Those who possessed swimming ability faced a terrible choice between attempting to reach the New Guinea coast through shark-infested waters with dangerous currents, or clinging to floating debris while hoping for rescue that might never arrive. The destroyer Shikinami, which was one of the few escort vessels still operational, began pulling survivors from the water. Captain Masamichi Ueno's crew worked frantically, hauling men aboard their ship as rapidly as they could manage. They succeeded in saving approximately 300 men in the first hour of rescue operations. But then American aircraft returned to the area. The follow-up attacks conducted on March 4th specifically targeted lifeboats and rafts where survivors had gathered. Machine gun bullets churned the sea surface into foam. Life rafts disintegrated under concentrated fire from aircraft. PT boats also participated in operations designed to prevent Japanese survivors from reaching the shore, following orders intended to ensure that enemy soldiers wouldn't succeed in reinforcing the garrison at Leh. For the Japanese military observers who managed to survive the attacks, the engagement revealed a devastating truth about the changing nature of warfare. American innovation had created weapons and tactics that they hadn't imagined were possible. The skip bombing technique, which had been developed and perfected in just a few months, had no corresponding counter-tactic in Japanese military doctrine. Ships couldn't depress their anti-aircraft guns sufficiently to engage planes flying at mast height. Torpedoes couldn't be aimed at aircraft. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine proved completely useless against this new form of attack. The firepower mounted on the B-25s was particularly shocking to Japanese observers. Japanese fighters typically carried two 7.7mm machine guns, occasionally supplemented by 20mm cannons. These bombers were carrying 850 caliber machine guns, which represented the equivalent firepower of multiple fighters, all aimed forward in the same direction, all controlled by a single pilot's trigger. Even more disturbing than the raw firepower was the level of coordination displayed during the attack. The engagement involved American B-17, B-25s, A-20 from the 3rd Attack Group, and Australian Beaufighters, totaling over 100 aircraft from different units, different services, and even different nations, all working in perfect synchronization. They communicated throughout the battle, adjusting tactics in real time based on radio reports being transmitted during the engagement. As night fell across the battle area on March 3rd, the surviving Japanese destroyers returned to the site, searching desperately for any survivors they could locate. What they found was an ocean covered with debris and corpses. Oil fires still burned on the water's surface in multiple locations. The destroyer Hatsuyuki arrived from Kavieng bringing fuel, which allowed the rescue operations to continue through the night hours. In total, approximately 2,700 men were pulled from the water and returned to Rabaul. Another 1,200, including those who had been landed at Leh before the main attack occurred, eventually made it to the garrison. Of the 6,900 troops who had departed Rabaul with high hopes of reinforcing the New Guinea operations, 2,890 were dead. The 51st Division had effectively ceased to exist as a combat-capable fighting force before firing a single shot at enemy forces. All the ammunition, food, medical supplies and equipment that had been loaded aboard the transports to sustain operations for months had gone down with the ships. The aviation fuel that had been aboard the Kenbu Maru, which was supposed to keep Japanese aircraft flying operations for weeks, was now merely a slick floating on the Bismarck Sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the combined fleet as its commander-in-chief, received the battle report while in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi, which was anchored at Truk. According to staff officers who were present, he sat in complete silence for an extended period before speaking. The implications of what had occurred were absolutely clear to his strategic mind. Japan could no longer reinforce its forward garrisons using surface convoys within range of Allied air power. The lifeline to forward bases had been cut. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented far more than just a tactical defeat for Japanese forces. It signified a fundamental shift in how warfare would be conducted throughout the Pacific theatre. Never again would Japanese commanders attempt to reinforce their garrisons using surface convoys within range of Allied aircraft. The strategic implications rippled through every level of Japanese military planning. General Imamura personally flew to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to deliver his report on what had transpired. In a meeting that lasted 6 hours, he presented evidence demonstrating that American air power had evolved beyond Japanese ability to effectively counter it. The Americans weren't merely building greater numbers of aircraft, they were revolutionizing the fundamental methods by which aircraft fought against surface vessels. On March 25, 1943, a joint Army-Navy Central Agreement on Southwest Area operations gave priority to operations in New Guinea over those being conducted in the Solomon Islands. But without the capability to reinforce positions by sea, this prioritization was essentially an empty gesture. Japanese forces fighting in New Guinea would have to continue their operations without any realistic hope of significant reinforcement or resupply from external sources. For the Americans, the victory validated 2 years of innovation and tactical adaptation. General George Kenney, who commanded the 5th Air Force, had transformed his organization from a traditional bombing unit operating under conventional doctrine into something unprecedented in military history. An aerial navy capable of controlling sea lanes without requiring surface ships to accomplish the mission. Major Ed Larner, whose 91st Squadron had led the skip bombing attack that devastated the convoy, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the engagement. The citation specifically praised his extraordinary achievement in leading the attack that destroyed the Japanese convoy. Tragically, Larner died just 58 days later, on April 30, 1943, when his B-25 crashed during landing approach at Dobodura. He had successfully survived 87 combat missions, only to die in what was essentially a routine accident. The North American Aviation Company immediately began incorporating guns field modifications into their factory production processes. By late 1943, B-25G models were rolling off assembly lines with built-in forward firepower that included even a 75mm cannon, though the cannon proved less practical in combat than the multiple machine guns. The B-25H model would eventually carry 14 forward-firing machine guns. The B-25J could be configured with 18 guns, making it one of the most heavily armed aircraft of the entire war. Beyond all the strategic implications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented profound human tragedy on a massive scale. The 2,890 Japanese who died weren't merely statistics in a military report. They were sons, fathers, and husbands. Many were conscripts who had been farmers, clerks, or students before being drafted into a war they barely understood and had never wanted. The American pilots who participated in the strafing missions against survivors understood the military necessity of preventing enemy soldiers from reaching shore and reinforcing the garrison, but that understanding didn't make their actions any easier to bear psychologically. Some aircrew members reported experiencing nightmares about those particular missions for years afterward. The success demonstrated at the Bismarck Sea triggered an acceleration of American tactical innovation across multiple fronts. Within months of the battle, new techniques were being developed and implemented. Parafrags, which were parachute-equipped fragmentation bombs designed for attacking airfields, allowed low-level bombing without aircraft suffering damage from their own explosions. White phosphorus bombs were developed for marking targets. Improved skip bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms were manufactured. Each innovation built upon America's vast industrial capacity. Americans could afford to experiment extensively because failure cost only material resources, and material resources were essentially unlimited from America's industrial base. Japanese innovation increasingly stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources that couldn't be easily replaced. By contrast, Japanese forces increasingly relied on spiritual rather than material solutions to their military problems. The kamikaze concept, which involved using pilots as essentially guided missiles, emerged partly from the recognition that they couldn't match American technology through conventional means. If Japanese forces couldn't outbuild or out-innovate the Americans using industrial methods, they would attempt to outdie them through superior willingness to sacrifice. Crucial to the Allied victory was American code-breaking capability. The Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne and naval intelligence officers in Washington had successfully decrypted Japanese messages that revealed the convoy's schedule, route, and composition. General Kenny knew exactly when and where to position his forces to strike for maximum effect. This intelligence advantage had to be carefully protected through operational deception. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to appear to discover the convoy through visual observation, maintaining the fiction that visual sighting rather than signals intelligence had provided the warning that allowed forces to be positioned. The deception proved so successful that Japanese forces never realized their encryption codes were compromised, and they continued using the same communication systems throughout the remainder of the war. The Royal Australian Air Force's role in the battle demonstrated the effectiveness of Allied coordination across national boundaries. RAAF Bow fighters from No. 30 Squadron and Boston's from No. 22 Squadron flew alongside American aircraft, communicating on the same radio frequencies and following the same tactical plans. Squadron leader members of the RAAF flew 3 separate sorties during the battle. He would later receive the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions in subsequent operations before being captured and executed by Japanese forces. The integration of Australian and American forces stood in stark contrast to Japanese military operations, where Army and Navy units rarely coordinated effectively, often competing for scarce resources rather than cooperating toward common objectives. Behind the modified B-25s that destroyed the convoy lay an incredible supply chain stretching thousands of miles back to American factories. Each individual B-25 required 165,000 separate parts manufactured in dozens of different states across America. The 50 caliber ammunition they fired was produced in manufacturing plants scattered from Connecticut to California, with billions of rounds manufactured during the war years. The skip bombing technique required special delayed action fuses, which were manufactured by the millions in American munitions plants. The fuel consumed during training flights came from Texas oil fields and Louisiana refineries. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft arrived weekly by ship from the United States. This entire supply chain operated while America was simultaneously fighting a major war in Europe, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with massive quantities of war material and maintaining military forces scattered across the entire Pacific theatre. The Japanese convoy destroyed at the Bismarck Sea represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. The forces that destroyed that convoy were a tiny fraction of American total production capability. The American pilots who devastated the convoy had averaged 400 flight hours of training before entering combat operations. They had practiced skip bombing techniques for weeks, using virtually unlimited quantities of fuel and ammunition. Each pilot had dropped dozens of practice bombs before the actual mission. By contrast, Japanese pilots entering combat in 1943 were increasingly being sent into battle with less than 100 hours of total flight time. Fuel shortages meant minimal training opportunities. The veteran pilots who might have taught them proper techniques were already dead, killed by the industrial mathematics of American production superiority. New Japanese pilots were essentially flying students being thrown into combat against experienced American aviators who had extensive training. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea became strategically isolated from supply and reinforcement. Supplies had to be delivered by submarine, which was dangerous and extremely limited in cargo capacity. Alternatively, supplies could be delivered by fast destroyer runs conducted at night, which were equally hazardous and completely insufficient for supporting major military operations. These so-called Tokyo Express runs could deliver only a small fraction of what the destroyed convoy had been carrying. The Japanese turned to using barges, attempting to creep along the coastline at night with supplies. These barges became prime targets for PT boats and modified B-25s that had been equipped with radar equipment for night hunting operations. By June of 1943, Japanese forces in New Guinea were subsisting on half rations. By September, they were reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and roots. The army that had conquered Singapore was literally starving to death, defeated not primarily by bullets, but by the interdiction of supply lines through air power. For Japanese military culture, which was rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, emphasizing personal combat and individual heroism, the industrialized slaughter witnessed at the Bismarck Sea was profoundly incomprehensible. There was no honor in being machine-gunned while helpless in the water. There was no warrior's glory in starving to death because supply ships couldn't reach forward positions. Japanese forces would increasingly resort to suicidal tactics, including banzai charges and kamikaze attacks, seeking meaningful death in the face of mechanized killing that offered no opportunity for traditional martial glory. Americans would respond with ever more firepower and ever more technology, ever more industrial solutions to military problems. The gap between traditional warrior culture and industrialized warfare would only continue widening as the war progressed. Papi Gunn had installed cameras in the tail sections of his modified B-25s, configured to activate automatically when bombs were released. These cameras captured the destruction of the convoy in devastating photographic detail. Ships exploding, capsizing, and burning were all documented. The photographs provided unprecedented documentation of the battle's effectiveness. These images served multiple important purposes beyond simple record-keeping. They provided accurate battle damage assessment, allowing intelligence officers to verify pilot claims of ships destroyed rather than relying on potentially exaggerated reports. They became invaluable training aids, showing future pilots exactly how skip bombing techniques worked under actual combat conditions. They also served as powerful propaganda tools, demonstrating American military power to both allies and enemies around the world. The Japanese had no equivalent photographic capability, instead relying on pilot reports that were often inaccurate due to the confusion and stress of combat conditions. The B-25s that destroyed the convoy had been flying continuously for months in the exceptionally harsh conditions of New Guinea operations. Tropical heat, humidity that bred corrosion in metal components, and coral dust that abraded engines all took their toll on aircraft. Yet mechanical failures during the actual mission were remarkably rare. American engines were deliberately over-engineered, designed with power reserves that allowed them to continue functioning even when they weren't perfectly maintained according to specifications. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, suffered from increasingly poor maintenance as the war continued. Spare parts became increasingly scarce, and qualified mechanics even scarcer. Engines that were theoretically superior to American designs in laboratory conditions failed more frequently in combat because they couldn't be properly maintained under field conditions. The Japanese Navy's prized Zero fighters were increasingly grounded for lack of spare parts, while American aircraft flew daily combat missions without interruption. During the battle, American and Australian aircraft communicated constantly via radio equipment. Pilots reported target locations, warned each other of fighter attacks, and coordinated their approaches in real time. This continuous information sharing multiplied combat effectiveness enormously, allowing aircraft to support each other tactically and exploit opportunities as they emerged during the fluid combat situation. Japanese communications capabilities were minimal and often completely non-functional. Radio equipment was notoriously unreliable, frequencies weren't standardized between different military services, and radio discipline was generally poor. Ships and aircraft often fought in isolation, unable to coordinate effectively with each other or warn of developing threats. American pilots flew into battle with the knowledge that if they were shot down and wounded, they had excellent chances of survival and recovery. Blood plasma, morphine, sulfur drugs, and eventually penicillin were standard equipment in American medical kits. Medical evacuation by air was routine procedure, with wounded pilots often arriving in fully equipped hospitals within hours of being shot down. Japanese soldiers and sailors knew that serious wounds likely meant death. Medical supplies were desperately short even before the convoy's destruction eliminated months' worth of medical stores. The medicines that might have saved lives were now resting at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. This knowledge fundamentally affected morale and combat effectiveness. American pilots flew with confidence born of knowing they would receive excellent care if wounded, while Japanese forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they were essentially expendable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea cost Japan ships and aircraft it simply couldn't afford to lose at this stage of the war. The 8 transports represented many months of production from Japanese shipyards that were already strained far beyond normal capacity. The destroyed supplies and ammunition represented significant portions of Japanese industrial production that couldn't possibly be replaced given resource constraints. For America, the battle was economically insignificant in the larger context of the war effort. The ammunition expended during the engagement was replaced within days from existing stockpiles. The few aircraft lost were replaced within hours from reserves. American factories were producing 100,000 aircraft annually by 1943, which worked out to nearly 300 aircraft per day. The fuel consumed in both training and combat operations was essentially a rounding error in American petroleum production capacity. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea would reverberate through the remainder of the Pacific War in multiple ways. It proved conclusively that air power alone could control sea lanes without requiring naval vessels to be physically present. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that industrial innovation could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. For Japanese forces throughout the theatre, it marked the beginning of the end in the Southwest Pacific region. Cut off from reinforcement and supply by sea, they would fight a series of increasingly desperate holding actions, each one ending in either annihilation or slow starvation. The island-hopping strategy that MacArthur would employ became viable specifically because Japanese garrisons could be isolated and bypassed, left to wither without supplies, while American forces advanced past them toward more strategically significant objectives. The success achieved at the Bismarck Sea directly accelerated B-25 development programs. The B-25G model entering service in late 1943 carried a 75mm cannon, which was the largest weapon ever mounted on a twin-engine bomber design. Though the cannon ultimately proved less practical than multiple machine guns in combat application, it demonstrated American willingness to experiment with radical weapon concepts. Each successive iteration of the B-25 design reflected lessons learned from combat and American industrial capability to implement design changes rapidly. Post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents revealed how thoroughly the Bismarck Sea defeat had shaken Japanese confidence at the highest levels of command. Intelligence reports from the combined fleet began emphasizing American material superiority rather than tactical or strategic superiority, which represented a significant shift from earlier assessments that had attributed American successes primarily to luck or Japanese tactical mistakes. One particularly revealing captured report stated explicitly that the enemy's production capacity allowed them to implement new tactics faster than counters could possibly be developed by Japanese forces. This recognition of fundamental industrial disadvantage marked a crucial shift in Japanese strategic thinking across all theatres. After the Bismarck Sea engagement, Imperial General Headquarters conducted a comprehensive review of Japanese strategy throughout the Southwest Pacific region. The conclusions reached were profoundly sobering for Japanese planners. Surface reinforcement of forward bases was no longer operationally possible. American air power had achieved operational supremacy that couldn't be challenged. The industrial gap separating the two nations was widening rather than narrowing as the war continued. Traditional naval superiority had become irrelevant if ships couldn't survive concentrated air attack. The recommendation emerging from this analysis was to abandon all offensive operations and prepare instead for defense of the inner perimeter around the home islands. But even this defensive strategy assumed that American attacks would come at a pace that Japan could match, which was an assumption that would prove tragically optimistic in the months ahead. The skip bombing technique that was pioneered and perfected at the Bismarck Sea spread rapidly throughout American air forces operating in multiple theaters. Navy PBY Catalina flying boats adopted the technique for night attacks on Japanese shipping. Marine Corps pilots employed it extensively during the Solomons campaign. Even transport pilots received training in the technique in case they unexpectedly encountered enemy shipping during routine flights. This rapid proliferation of tactical innovations was possible specifically because America had achieved standardized training, equipment, and communications across all services and theaters. A technique developed and proven in New Guinea could be implemented in operations in the Aleutians within just weeks. Japanese forces, hampered by deep service rivalries and poor communication between commands, rarely shared innovations effectively even within the same theater of operations. The raw numbers tell the story of American industrial supremacy that made the Bismarck Sea victory operationally possible. During the entire duration of World War II, American factories produced 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Ammunition manufacturing plants produced 12 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Flight training schools graduated 193,440 pilots. Every single component required for B-25 operations was stockpiled in multiple locations scattered across the Pacific Theater. Against this industrial tsunami of production, Japanese military courage and fighting spirit were essentially irrelevant factors. The bravest samurai warrior couldn't overcome the cold mathematics of mass production on an industrial scale. Pappy Gunn's camera installations in modified aircraft provided unprecedented documentation of combat effectiveness that could be studied in detail. The footage captured was analyzed frame by tactical analysts, revealing optimal parameters for skip bombing attacks. Bomb release should occur at altitudes between 200 and 250 feet. Approach speed should be maintained at 245 miles per hour. Release distance should be 60 to 100 feet from the target for maximum effectiveness. This scientific approach to warfare, constantly measuring, analyzing, and optimizing based on empirical data, was quintessentially American in character. War became fundamentally an engineering problem requiring industrial solutions rather than primarily a test of warrior spirit and martial culture. The loss of supplies during the Bismarck Sea engagement created an immediate crisis for Japanese forces operating throughout New Guinea. Within just weeks of the battle, frontline units began reporting critical shortages across all categories of supplies. Ammunition allocation was restricted to just 10 rounds per day per individual soldier. Rice rations were reduced to 400 grams daily per man. Medical supplies were completely exhausted with no prospect of resupply. Fuel for vehicles became completely unavailable. Aircraft were grounded indefinitely for lack of replacement parts. American forces operating in the same theater, by stark contrast, complained if ice cream wasn't available on a daily basis. The economic disparity separating the two sides was so vast that captured Japanese soldiers frequently didn't believe that American supply levels were genuinely real, assuming instead that they were being shown propaganda displays rather than actual operational supply levels. The success achieved at the Bismarck Sea directly accelerated American innovation in aerial warfare across multiple technical areas. Within months of the battle, new developments were being implemented, including improved skip bombing fuses featuring more reliable delay mechanisms, napalm weapons for area attacks on Japanese defensive positions, rocket-assisted bombs providing increased penetration capability, and white phosphorus markers for improved target identification. Each innovation built directly upon industrial capacity to experiment freely and implement changes rapidly based on combat experience. Americans could afford failed experiments because they cost only material resources that could be easily replaced. Japanese innovation became increasingly stagnant because every single experiment consumed irreplaceable resources that couldn't be regenerated. Behind every B-25 that participated in attacks at the Bismarck Sea stood a dedicated maintenance crew that kept aircraft flying under primitive field conditions. These men, working in jungle workshops without proper facilities, performed daily mechanical miracles that kept the air campaign functioning. Engines were completely overhauled in improvised jungle workshops using hand tools. Battle damage was expertly repaired using improvised materials and field-expedient methods. Combat modifications were implemented using nothing but hand tools and ingenuity. Aircraft were turned around between successive combat missions in just hours rather than days. This maintenance capability directly reflected American industrial training systems that had created a vast pool of technical expertise. Hundreds of thousands of Americans possessed the skills necessary to fix engines, repair electrical systems, and work metal to precise tolerances. This enormous pool of distributed technical expertise was perhaps America's single greatest military advantage beyond raw production numbers. The controversial strafing of survivors floating in the water, which troubled even American participants, served a harsh but calculated military purpose. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific Theater learned through bitter experience that attempting to reach shore after their transport ships were sunk meant facing likely death from strafing aircraft or PT boats. This psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation at the Bismarck Sea, affecting Japanese morale and willingness to attempt sea transport in all future engagements. General Douglas MacArthur characterized the Bismarck Sea as the decisive aerial engagement in the entire Southwest Pacific campaign. His public communiqué claimed somewhat inflated Japanese losses in typical MacArthur fashion, but the genuine strategic impact of the victory justified his theatrical enthusiasm. Air power had conclusively proven that it could interdict sea transportation lanes as effectively as submarines or surface naval vessels operating in the same role. Admiral Yamamoto, carefully reading the detailed battle reports arriving from the Bismarck Sea, made what would prove to be a fateful decision. He would personally visit forward bases throughout the region to boost troop morale that had been shattered by the catastrophic defeat. This decision, driven largely by the depression and despair following the Bismarck Sea disaster, would lead directly to his death on April 18, 1943. American codebreakers decrypted messages revealing his detailed itinerary, and P-38 Lightning fighters successfully intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville, killing the architect of Pearl Harbor. American forces institutionalized all the lessons learned from the Bismarck Sea with remarkable speed. Within just weeks of the battle, comprehensive training manuals were updated to incorporate skip bombing techniques as standard doctrine. New pilots arriving in theater were immediately practicing low-level attacks as part of their combat preparation. Tactical doctrine was thoroughly revised throughout the theater to emphasize anti-shipping operations as a primary mission. The Army Air Force's Tactical Center conducted detailed analysis of every aspect of the battle, producing comprehensive reports that were distributed throughout all Pacific commands. Japanese institutional learning was severely hampered by multiple systemic problems inherent in their military culture. Deep service rivalries between Army and Navy prevented honest analysis of failures. The two services blamed each other for defeats rather than examining fundamental weaknesses in doctrine or capability. Cultural concerns about saving face obscured honest examination of tactical failures. By the time Japanese forces managed to develop even partial counters to skip bombing techniques, American tactical innovation had already moved forward to entirely new methods of attack. The B-25 modifications that had proved so devastatingly successful in combat went into immediate mass production at factories in the United States. North American Aviation's manufacturing facilities in Kansas City and Inglewood retooled their production lines within just weeks of receiving combat reports. By late 1943, brand new B-25 bombers were coming directly from the factory floor with 8 to 14 forward-firing machine guns installed as standard equipment, reinforced nose structure specifically designed for gun installation, upgraded engines that were optimized for low-level performance profiles, improved armor protection for aircrew members, and built-in camera installations for automatic battle documentation. This remarkably rapid transition from field modification using salvaged parts to standardized mass production exemplified American industrial flexibility that Japan could never hope to match given resource constraints. After the success demonstrated at the Bismarck Sea, American bomber crew training programs incorporated low-level attack techniques as standard curriculum at all training bases. Student pilots practiced skip bombing techniques at training facilities scattered across Texas and Arizona, using target ships positioned in the Gulf of Mexico and California's Salton Sea. This training program was extraordinarily fuel-intensive by any reasonable standard. Each individual pilot consumed thousands of gallons of precious aviation fuel simply learning the skip bombing technique before ever entering combat. But America could easily afford this seemingly extravagant training expenditure. By 1943, American refineries were producing 1.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel annually, while Japan struggled desperately to import barely enough fuel to keep its naval fleet minimally operational. Several B-25s returned from the Bismarck Sea mission carrying significant battle damage from Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Aircraft showed holes from anti-aircraft shell fragments, damaged control surfaces that affected flight characteristics, and shot-up engines that were barely functioning. Within 72 hours of landing, every single damaged aircraft was flying again on combat missions, having been repaired using aluminum patches fabricated in field workshops, complete engines replaced using improvised hoisting equipment, control cables expertly spliced using salvaged materials from various sources, and fuel tanks carefully patched using rubber recovered from destroyed Japanese equipment. Japanese aircraft sustaining similar levels of battle damage would have been immediately written off as total losses, then cannibalized for spare parts if anything salvageable remained. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing operationally possible were genuine marvels of precision engineering, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Each fuse had to survive the tremendous impact shock of hitting water at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, continue functioning reliably after experiencing multiple skips across the wave surface, and then detonate at precisely the correct moment to maximize damage while allowing the attacking aircraft to escape the blast radius. American factories produced these precision fuses by the millions during the war, with each individual unit tested and certified before shipment. Japanese fuses employed similar theoretical principles, but suffered from failure rates exceeding 20% by 1943 due to mounting quality control problems in manufacturing and increasingly severe material shortages affecting production. American aircraft located the Japanese convoy precisely when and where intelligence had predicted, despite challenging weather conditions and the enormous distances involved. This operational success reflected clear American superiority in multiple areas of navigation technology and training. American pilots averaged 400 hours of flight training before entering combat operations. Navigation equipment, including accurate compasses and precision instruments, was standard. Map quality was exceptional, based on detailed charts created from pre-war surveying expeditions. Weather forecasting provided meteorological support that accurately predicted when protective cloud cover would dissipate. Japanese navigation capabilities increasingly relied on simply following lead aircraft or identifying coastal landmarks, which severely limited operational flexibility and range. American intelligence services had known about the convoy's departure through successful code-breaking operations, but this critical secret had to be carefully protected from Japanese discovery. Elaborate reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to appear to discover the convoy through visual observation, meticulously maintaining the fiction that visual sighting rather than signals intelligence had provided the advance warning. The operational deception proved so completely successful that Japanese forces never realized their encryption codes had been thoroughly compromised. They continued using identical communication systems that American cryptographers were reading on a daily basis throughout the remainder of the war. The 1,200 Japanese soldiers who eventually reached Leh after the convoy's destruction found a garrison that was already subsisting on significantly reduced rations. The massive supplies that were supposed to sustain military operations for months had been completely destroyed. Within just weeks of the battle, Japanese forces were desperately foraging for anything edible in the surrounding jungle. Disease rapidly became epidemic throughout the garrison. Malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers, and simple malnutrition decimated unit after unit. By June of 1943, the effective combat strength of Japanese forces at Leh had been reduced by 60% through disease and starvation alone, without significant combat action. American pilots participating in the Bismarck Sea attacks were serving limited combat tours, typically consisting of 50 combat missions or 6 months of operations, whichever came first, before being rotated back to the United States to serve as instructors training the next generation of pilots. This systematic rotation system preserved hard-won combat experience and effectively disseminated tactical lessons throughout the entire force. Combat veterans became training instructors, passing on invaluable combat techniques and hard-learned lessons to successive generations of new pilots. Japanese pilots, by contrast, flew continuous combat operations until they were inevitably killed. The expertise they had gained at terrible cost through combat experience was lost forever when they died. By late 1943, the majority of experienced Japanese pilots were already dead, and their replacement pilots were increasingly poorly trained novices being thrown into combat against American veterans who had extensive training and combat experience. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented a remarkable convergence of multiple American technological and organizational advantages operating simultaneously. Industrial capacity allowed production of modified aircraft in quantity. An innovation culture encouraged and rewarded field modifications and tactical experimentation. Training resources enabled perfecting completely new tactics through extensive practice. Intelligence capability allowed locating targets precisely through code breaking. Communication systems enabled coordinating extraordinarily complex attacks involving multiple units. Supply chains sustained intensive operations over vast distances. No single advantage among these was individually decisive. Their combination operating together proved absolutely overwhelming against Japanese forces. The Japanese military faced not merely superior numbers of aircraft and ships, but fundamentally superior systems spanning industrial production, technological innovation, and organizational capability that they simply couldn't match given their resource base. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted only 3 days in total, with the absolutely decisive action occurring in merely 15 minutes on the morning of March 3, 1943. In those brief 15 minutes, the fundamental nature of warfare throughout the Pacific Theater changed forever in ways that would determine the war's ultimate outcome. Air power had proved conclusively beyond any doubt that it could control vital sea lanes without requiring naval vessels to be physically present. Industrial innovation had demonstrated convincingly that it could create entirely new forms of warfare significantly faster than enemies could possibly develop effective counters. American production had shown definitively that sheer quantity, when properly applied through sound tactics, possessed a quality all its own that overcame any amount of fighting spirit. For the Japanese military establishment, the Bismarck Sea represented far more than simply another tactical defeat to be absorbed. It was undeniable proof that their entire traditional approach to warfare had become completely obsolete in the face of industrial modernity. Courage, warrior spirit, and centuries of martial tradition meant absolutely nothing when confronted by modified B-25s carrying 8 forward-firing machine guns and dropping skip bombs with scientific precision. Even the best-trained warrior was utterly helpless against an enemy who replaced individual skill with mass-produced systems. The 2,890 Japanese who died in the waters of the Bismarck Sea were victims not merely of American bombs and bullets, but of a profound technological and industrial revolution that had rendered their traditional form of warfare as obsolete and irrelevant as the samurai sword. They had trained extensively for war against other warriors following recognizable codes. Instead, they died in a war against machines and industrial systems they couldn't possibly match. For the Americans, the Bismarck Sea comprehensively validated years of preparation, experimentation, and tactical innovation. Pappy guns, improvised field modifications, developed using salvaged parts and hand tools in primitive jungle workshops, had proven more devastatingly effective than any purpose-built weapon system designed in laboratories. The marriage of characteristically American ingenuity with unmatched industrial capacity had produced an entirely new form of warfare that Japan simply couldn't counter using any available means. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate Southwest Pacific theater of operations. It demonstrated definitively for all observers that in modern industrialized warfare, industrial capacity fundamentally equals military capacity. The nation that could build the most equipment, train the most personnel, innovate the fastest, and adapt most quickly to changing circumstances would inevitably prevail, regardless of traditional military virtues. Courage, loyalty, and willingness for self-sacrifice remained important human qualities, but they were no longer sufficient by themselves to win wars between industrial nations. In 15 minutes of combat over the Bismarck Sea, 8 modified bombers accomplished what the entire Imperial Japanese Navy couldn't prevent despite their best efforts. They permanently cut Japan's vital supply lines and doomed Japanese forces throughout New Guinea to slow starvation and ultimate defeat. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who witnessed these attacks were right to feel incredulous about what they were seeing. They were observing something that shouldn't have been possible according to everything they had been taught about naval warfare throughout their careers. But American industrial innovation had systematically made the previously impossible into routine procedure, transforming the unthinkable into standard operating practice. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands in history as definitive proof that in modern industrialized warfare, the nation with the most productive factories will inevitably defeat the nation with the bravest individual soldiers. This lesson was written in flames across the waters of the Huon Gulf in a manner that could never be forgotten or denied, a lesson that would define every subsequent engagement throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. In the age of truly industrial warfare, production capacity is genuine power, innovation capability is strategy, and the assembly line ultimately proves mightier than any sword. The Japanese observers couldn't believe what they were witnessing when modified B-25 strafers destroyed 8 transport ships in merely 15 minutes of concentrated attack. By the time they finally accepted this new reality and understood its implications, events had already progressed beyond any possibility of reversal. The war had been lost not in those 15 minutes of visible destruction, but in the preceding years of industrial preparation and innovation that made those 15 minutes of devastation operationally possible. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea simply marked the precise moment when that long-prepared victory became undeniably visible to everyone who witnessed the engagement.